Chosen ones, hear the pulse of eternity as it beats within you. Long before the world called your name, before any crown rested on a mortal's head, there was a scroll sealed in fire, inked not with ink, but with essence. This was the contract written between heaven and earth, etched into your very soul, not by your choice, but by divine appointment. You were seen, known, and marked, long before presidents, kings, or rulers knew of your existence. The president sat alone in his chamber that night, the dim light casting restless shadows across the room. On his desk lay an ancient parchment, a document that seemed older than nations themselves. As his trembling hands unrolled it, he realized it bore not policies, not decrees, but destinies. Within its words burned your name, within its lines your covenant. His breath grew uneven, his chest heavy, as if the very weight of prophecy had fallen upon his shoulders. The words shifted as though alive, their glow flickering like a heartbeat. He read of battles not yet fought, victories not yet won, and a remnant not yet revealed. Each word pressed against him with an authority greater than his office, greater than the nations he governed. He was not just reading ink, he was reading eternity. And then there was the seal, a mark unlike any signature of man, a sign carved by the hand of the Eternal One. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched his racing heart. He tried to steady himself, but the parchment carried a truth he could not escape. The fate of rulers was tethered to the destiny of the chosen. But what did it mean for him to hold this knowledge? To gaze into a contract that tied your breath to the rise and fall of empires? The silence of the chamber deepened, as though unseen eyes lingered in the corners, watching, waiting. The air itself seemed to whisper, "What you have read cannot be undone. The seal cannot be broken." And as he leaned back, the contract still glowing before him, he realized the real question was not whether he could bear its truth, but whether you would rise to walk in it. The president could not steady his fingers. His pen lay useless beside him, for the weight of the parchment had stripped him of every illusion of control. Power he understood, votes, armies, treaties, the mechanics of authority, but this was different. This was not power that could be negotiated or wielded. This was destiny staring back at him, inscribed with a fire older than creation itself. Each line he traced with his eyes burned deeper into his mind, as though the words were alive, branding themselves into his conscience. He rose from his seat and paced the length of the chamber. The room that had so often been filled with the voices of advisors now felt suffocatingly silent, as if even time itself refused to intrude upon the revelation. He pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the hammering of his heart. It was as if the contract was not only written before him, but written into him, pulling every hidden fear and every buried question to the surface. The paper seemed fragile, almost translucent, yet its presence carried a gravity that no human decree could rival. He thought of the nations outside his walls, of the weight of millions whose lives depended on his decisions, and yet none of that compared to what this covenant demanded. For here was a script that did not bend to his authority. Here was a decree that spoke as though the Eternal himself had set it in motion, a decree that linked the rise of empires to the unseen heartbeat of chosen lives scattered across the earth. He ran his hand across the desk, searching for grounding, but found only the relentless glow of the scroll. His reflection in the polished wood looked older, more fragile, as though a single glimpse of destiny had aged him. He whispered to himself, asking questions he dared not speak aloud, afraid of who or what might answer. Somewhere within the parchment, a phrase shifted again, alive and breathing. It called out, not in a voice of sound, but of resonance, tugging at the deepest place of his soul. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. Was he holding a warning or a summons? Was this the unveiling of salvation or the unraveling of nations? The scroll lay open, its surface shimmering like a mirror of eternity, revealing what no mortal eye was meant to see. The president leaned closer, though every fiber of his being urged him to look away. The words rearranged themselves, as if unseen fingers turned the lines into living fire. They spoke of promises made in secret, vows whispered not on earth, but in realms unseen. These were not treaties signed by kings, nor compacts forged by nations. They were oaths older than language, written in a script that pulsed with divine authority. His breath quickened as the letters shifted again, glowing brighter. Within their light, he caught fleeting visions, armies moving like shadows, towers crumbling, oceans roaring against the shores of nations. Yet among these storms, there was a single figure walking calmly across the chaos, carrying a light that pierced every darkness. The president recoiled, for the image felt too alive, too close, as though the scroll itself was unveiling not only the fate of empires, but the identity of one who walked beyond time. A fragment of ancient text rose from the page, whispering into his mind with a voice that did not belong to this world. He was the Word made flesh, and the covenant rests upon his shoulders. The president stumbled backward, clutching the edge of his chair. He had heard those words before, in speeches, in sermons long forgotten, but never had they carried such weight. They were no longer scripture to be quoted. They were an oath embedded into the very foundation of the scroll. He pressed his trembling hand against the parchment, but the words burned hotter beneath his touch, searing not his skin but his soul. The chamber darkened as though the very walls withdrew, leaving him alone with the glow of the contract and the echo of that name. He tried to steady his breath, to convince himself that this was nothing more than vision or dream, but the rhythm of the seal pulsed with undeniable reality. If these oaths were true, then the world he governed was not the center of power at all. It was only a stage upon which the greater covenant unfolded. And if the scroll had chosen to reveal this truth to him, then it meant the time was not distant. The seal was stirring, and the hand that once carried the cross seemed ready to... The president sat in silence, his desk no longer a place of command, but an altar where eternity had unveiled its script. He thought of the weight he carried, the authority of armies, the signature that could move nations, the voice that could stir the world. Yet now, all of it seemed small, fragile against the parchment that lay before him. His power was a passing flame, but the scroll carried a fire that did not fade. He remembered the oaths of office he had spoken, words bound by law, honored by tradition. But these words were not of law nor of man. They belonged to a realm untouched by policy or debate. They reached deeper, stretching past history itself, tying the pulse of his nation to a destiny not of his choosing. His pulse quickened, for he felt the distance between his throne and the true throne that had authored this decree. Outside, the world continued as though nothing had shifted. Cars filled the streets. Ministers debated in chambers. Voices argued over borders and budgets. Yet within these walls, prophecy had collided with power, and nothing could remain unchanged. He wondered if any other ruler had glimpsed this contract, if kings before him had felt this same weight and chosen silence. Perhaps nations had risen and fallen on the decisions of men who, in secret, had read what was never meant for mortal eyes. The parchment glowed softly, its edges curling as if touched by wind, though the air remained still. A phrase stirred again, reshaping itself, and he leaned in, desperate to see what it demanded. The words spoke of leaders whose crowns would become heavy with judgment, of kingdoms whose walls would tremble when weighed against eternal scales. He could feel the heat in his chest, not of fear alone, but of a knowing that the world he governed was already shifting beneath his feet. His hand hovered above the scroll, trembling as if contact might alter not just him, but the fate of millions. Power was slipping from the grasp of men and bowing before prophecy. He closed his eyes, but the glow pressed against his lids, demanding to be seen. When he opened them, the parchment no longer lay silent. It breathed, as though preparing to. The chamber grew colder, though no window was open, and no wind stirred the curtains. The president's breath hung in the air, faint mist rising as though the room itself had been drawn into another realm. He felt a presence before he saw it, an unseen weight pressing against his shoulders, a stillness that demanded reverence. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he turned. Behind his chair stood a figure cloaked in light. Wings arched high, vast and white, yet threaded with veins of fire that shimmered like molten glass. The eyes were neither cruel nor kind, but unyielding. Eyes that had seen thrones rise and kingdoms fall. Eyes that bore witness to the first words ever spoken into existence. The president gripped the desk for balance, for the strength of this presence made his legs weak. The angel did not speak at first, but the silence thundered louder than any voice. The scroll between them pulsed, its light answering the being's presence, as though both were bound to the same origin. When the voice finally came, it was not sound but resonance, vibrating through the marrow of his bones. You are reading what was never meant to be hidden. This covenant binds not only flesh and blood, but spirit and eternity. The president's heart raced. He wanted to ask questions, to demand why such revelations had been placed in his hands, but his lips would not move. The angel's gaze shifted toward the parchment, and the words upon it glowed brighter, revealing fragments of prophecy. Among the fire of judgment and the trembling of nations, there appeared again that solitary figure who walked unharmed through storms. The angel's voice softened, though the weight of it still crushed the air. The one you glimpse is the cornerstone rejected, yet he is the stone that holds the covenant. His blood sealed what kings could never write, and his name cannot be erased. The president's chest tightened, for he knew the figure was not myth nor memory, but living truth. He wanted to look away, to resist, yet the light burned deeper, demanding surrender. The angel stepped closer, wings folding slightly, and laid a hand upon the scroll. At that touch, the seal throbbed with a force that rattled the walls. The president braced himself, for the chamber itself seemed ready to. The walls of the chamber no longer looked like stone and wood. To the president's eyes, they blurred into shifting images, echoes of ages long past. The parchment on his desk vibrated with a soundless rhythm, as if memory itself had been awakened within its fibers. Suddenly, he saw shadows of ancient men standing at the edges of the room, figures draped in robes, faces veiled with mystery, hands clutching staffs that glowed faintly with hidden fire. They did not speak, yet their silence thundered louder than words. Their presence was heavy, and he realized they were keepers of a covenant older than his office, older than his nation. They seemed to carry fragments of stories written before time carved calendars, and each figure radiated the weight of a vow kept through centuries. He felt as if they were not merely visiting, but watching, measuring whether he was worthy to gaze upon what had been entrusted. The parchment's words shifted again, revealing fragments of a dialogue etched into eternity. He saw lines that spoke of altars raised in wilderness places, of blood spilled not for politics, but for promise, of fire descending from the heavens to consume sacrifices laid upon stone. These were not ceremonies of tradition, but acts that bound heaven and earth in ways he could not comprehend. The visions struck him with force. Armies parting seas, prophets calling down rain after years of drought, kings kneeling before voices that spoke from the unseen. Each moment was tied by a thread of covenant, a promise that echoed still within the scroll on his desk. His heart pounded, for he knew these echoes were not myths, but memories preserved in eternity, replaying themselves whenever the covenant stirred. The president gripped the arms of his chair, for the chamber trembled as if responding to the scroll's unveiling. The shadows of those ancient keepers turned their gaze toward him, eyes burning like embers in the night. He felt their weight pressing upon his soul, a silent question hanging in the air. Were these echoes awakening because of him, or because the time had come for their promises to erupt once more into the earth? The chamber no longer belonged to him alone. He could sense others, unseen yet present, surrounding the desk where the scroll still glowed. Their voices did not echo in the air, but in the hidden chambers of his mind, weaving together like threads of a tapestry too vast for mortal understanding. He closed his eyes, but the whispers grew louder, each word carrying weight as if carved from stone. The president heard them debating, not in human language, but in tones that vibrated deeper than sound. It was as though an unseen council had gathered, rulers not bound by time, but by eternity. They spoke of nations as though they were rivers to be redirected, kingdoms as if they were candles that could be snuffed or relit. He tried to focus, to grasp their meaning, but the more he listened, the more he realized their decisions had already been written. Among their voices, one rose above the others. It carried a gentleness that cut sharper than any decree, a sound that reached into the deepest fractures of his heart. It spoke not of kingdoms or thrones, but of a single life laid down like seed in the soil, buried yet destined to rise. The words pressed against his spirit. He was wounded for their transgressions, crushed for their iniquities. By his stripes, healing flows still. The president staggered, gripping the desk, for the voice had carried not only prophecy, but memory. The council fell silent, as though they, too, reverenced the weight of that name. He opened his eyes, gasping, and found the scroll glowing brighter, its seal pulsing like a heartbeat. The whispers resumed, though now they circled around him, weaving his very presence into their discourse. He felt as if the council was measuring him, questioning whether he would resist or yield to the covenant laid before him. The chamber shook faintly, a vibration rising through the floor, as though the very earth was responding to their deliberation. He wanted to cry out, to silence the voices, but the weight of their authority crushed every syllable in his throat. The president's eyes fixed on the scroll, where fresh lines began to surface, as though ink was being poured in real time. But this was not ink. The letters glowed deep crimson, shimmering as though drawn from a well far more ancient than the earth itself. Each word dripped with weight, binding itself into the parchment with finality. No quill had touched this surface, and no hand of man could ever erase what was written here. His throat tightened. He felt the weight of what he was seeing, for the glow of those crimson words carried a living presence. They pulsed like veins, as though the scroll itself had been infused with the lifeblood of a covenant no power could annul. He leaned closer, hesitant yet compelled, and as his gaze met the script, the chamber seemed to expand, walls dissolving into visions, not of this age, but of countless generations past. He saw figures kneeling at stone altars, their garments torn, their faces lifted toward heaven. He saw hands lifted in surrender, tears falling as sacrifices were laid upon fire. And always, beneath the cries of men and the smoke of offering, there was the crimson thread weaving its way forward, relentless, unbroken, binding each oath to the next. The blood was the ink of history, and the parchment of destiny could not hold its story without it. The president tried to step back, but the scroll drew him closer, its words calling out with a voice he could not silence. He felt as though it was not merely showing him history, but drawing him into it, binding his breath to the signature that had been written before him. He touched the edge of the desk, steadying himself, but his hand shook violently. The glow surged stronger, flooding the chamber in red light that bathed every corner like the dawn of another world. The crimson letters throbbed again, and he realized this was no ordinary ink. This was the covenant sealed by sacrifice, living proof that promises written in blood cannot be revoked. The president walked through the corridors of power, yet they felt different now. The walls that once echoed with the polished speeches of politicians seemed to hum with an unseen tension. Advisors passed by with folders in hand. Ministers whispered in side rooms, but beneath their words there was another voice, one that no human ear could detect. He felt it like a current beneath the floor, a war unfolding in silence, invisible but undeniable. Every step carried the weight of unseen eyes. He could sense movements behind the veil, shadows shifting between the pillars, presences locked in combat over decisions that appeared on the surface to be ordinary. Treaties and budgets, policies and debates, they were all threads in a larger tapestry, one woven in the hidden chambers of eternity. The president's chest tightened, for he knew that what played out in meetings and signatures was merely the echo of a conflict being decided elsewhere. As he entered the council hall, he paused. For an instant, the air shimmered, and he glimpsed figures not of flesh but of light and shadow, standing between the chairs where leaders would soon sit. They clashed without sound, their movements like lightning, their blows shaking the unseen fabric of the room. He blinked, and the vision faded, but the weight of it remained. The scroll's words echoed in his memory. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against powers of this dark world, and against spiritual forces in heavenly places. He had read those words before, long ago, when sermons had felt like ritual, But now they were alive, piercing through him with the clarity of war drums. He understood that the halls of authority were not neutral ground. They were battlefields where destinies were contested, line by line, choice by choice. He gripped the back of his chair, steadying himself, for the whispers of the unseen war pressed closer. Every paper before him, every decision awaiting his signature, seemed suddenly heavy with eternal consequence. He closed his eyes, and in that silence he heard it. The faint sound of a nail being driven into wood, a reminder that victory had already been sealed, though the battle still raged. The president sat at the long table of leaders, the air heavy with the sound of murmuring voices and shuffling papers. Flags of nations lined the walls, symbols of power that seemed unshakable. Yet beneath the surface of this gathering, he felt the scroll's influence pressing into the atmosphere. The names of nations carried weight, but there was another name, unspoken yet present, whose authority shook the ground beneath their feet. He leaned back in his chair as one delegate after another rose to speak, their words polished, their tones firm, each claiming strength for their people. Yet, with every declaration, the president sensed something greater stirring. It was as though the words spoken in confidence trembled against an unseen force, like waves colliding with a rock that could not be moved. He looked into the eyes of those around him and wondered if they too could feel it, that fragile tension between human pride and eternal decree. In his mind, he saw cities collapsing like towers of sand, armies scattering as though chased by wind, rulers losing their thrones in a single night. He tried to steady himself, but the vision pressed deeper, showing him the vulnerability of nations that believed themselves indestructible. All of it was tethered to a name that had not been spoken in that room, a name that carried the authority to topple empires without a single weapon raised. His chest tightened as he realized the scroll had not been given to him for curiosity, but for warning. The fate of nations was not balanced on military power or political alliances, but on their response to the covenant written before the foundations of time. That single name, hidden yet present, was already stirring the foundations of the earth, and he could feel the trembling of kingdoms that had built their strength on sand. The hall filled with applause as another leader concluded his speech, but the sound rang hollow in the president's ears. He could hear something else beneath it, a distant rumble, like the groaning of the earth itself, waiting for the moment when the weight of that unspoken name would fall upon them all. The chamber was still, though the president felt as though all creation leaned in around him. The scroll no longer shifted with fragments or glimpses. It had stilled into a single line that glowed brighter than the sun itself. His eyes burned, but he could not look away. This was not just another fragment of prophecy, nor another echo of covenant. It was the final line, the closing word written before the beginning of time, waiting for this moment to be unveiled. The glow pressed into his chest like fire, each heartbeat echoing the rhythm of eternity. He knew, with a certainty deeper than thought, that this was the sentence upon which all nations, all rulers, and all thrones would stand or fall. The words pulsed alive, and as they did, he heard the sound of a hammer striking wood, each blow reverberating through the marrow of his bones. The line revealed itself, but not as mere letters. It was a decree written in sacrifice, etched in the unyielding ink of blood. His lips trembled as he whispered the words aloud. Though he spoke them in his own tongue, they carried a resonance not of this world. The chamber shook, not violently, but with the subtle trembling of creation itself, recognizing the weight of its author. In the silence that followed, he heard a voice, gentle yet unshakable, whisper across the seal, "It is finished." The president fell back into his chair, his strength drained as though the weight of ages had pressed through him. The room was unchanged, yet everything was different. The scroll before him no longer burned with shifting words. It rested in stillness, as if waiting for his response. He realized now that the contract was not only revelation, but invitation. To read the final line was to be called into it, to carry the mark of a covenant sealed long before his breath first filled his lungs.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.